Sometimes the people you trust the most hand you the knife they plan to stab you with. Margaret spent decades building a perfect life until she discovered the cracks were carved by the man sleeping beside her. Watch what happens when a woman who's been broken learns that revenge isn't about rage, it's about balance. Stay till the end. You'll want to see how she makes him beg for mercy. Margaret had spent 30 years keeping her home spotless, her heart open, and her husband Richard happy. Their neighbors called them the perfect couple. She baked for church fundraisers, hosted dinner parties, and never missed his company events. Richard loved the image of success, and Margaret was the woman who polished that image for him. But one quiet Tuesday morning shattered everything. She'd gone to his office to surprise him for lunch, a small gesture, a simple act of love. But as she reached his door, laughter spilled out, the kind she hadn't heard from him in years. She froze. Through the frosted glass, she could make out two silhouettes, Richard's tall frame and a younger woman pressed against his desk. For a few seconds, Margaret couldn't breathe. Her throat burned, her pulse roared. She backed away before they saw her, walking out of the building like a ghost. The shock didn't break her, it sharpened her. For weeks, she watched him lie. The late meetings, the work trips, the fake smiles. Every time he looked her in the eye and said, "You know I love you, right?" she bit her tongue until it bled. One night, he came home smelling of cheap perfume and guilt. As he showered, she sat at the vanity, staring at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't weak. She wasn't the fool he believed she was. That night, Margaret began documenting everything. Bank statements, emails, texts, even his business accounts. He had secrets buried deep, and she was going to dig them all up. Weeks turned into months, and the image of the perfect wife became her greatest disguise. She smiled, she cooked, she kissed him goodbye every morning. But behind her gentle eyes, Margaret was calculating. The final straw came when she overheard Richard on the phone whispering to the same woman, Lena. The words still echoed in her head. "Just a little longer, baby. Once the divorce is done, I'll have everything." That was the moment Margaret stopped crying and started planning. One evening, Richard came home to find the lights dim, dinner ready, and Margaret in his favorite blue dress. She poured him a drink, her hand steady as stone. "You've been working so hard lately," she said softly, handing him the glass. He smiled, oblivious, trying to keep this family together. Her lips twitched. This family? He didn't notice the flicker in her eyes. That night, as he fell asleep beside her, Margaret stared at the ceiling, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow, the game begins." Because sometimes revenge doesn't need violence, it needs patience. And patience was Margaret's greatest weapon. Margaret woke before sunrise. The sky outside her window was painted gray, the kind of color that made the world feel still, almost waiting. She slipped out of bed quietly, her mind sharper than it had been in months. Every detail of her plan had crystallized overnight. For 30 years, she had managed their home and their life, meaning she knew where everything was, every account, every file, every password. Richard thought he was clever, but Margaret had been managing his world long before Lena came along. He might have forgotten that. She hadn't. She began small. A simple transfer from their joint account to one in her own name, then another. Always subtle, always just below the radar. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. And control, Margaret realized, was something she'd surrendered long ago. Not anymore. Richard's business, a real estate firm he'd built from her father's initial investment, had been struggling for months. Margaret had seen the numbers, he was too arrogant to admit it. The new contracts, the success trips he bragged about, were lies designed to keep up appearances. That's what men like him lived for, appearances. She decided to weaponize that. Margaret started showing up at the office again. Not often enough to raise suspicion, but just enough to remind people she existed. She brought coffee for the staff, smiled sweetly, and listened. People talked around her like she was invisible. It's funny how the older you get, the more people assume you're harmless. That's how she learned. Lena wasn't just the other woman, she was his assistant. Young, ambitious, hungry for power. The type who thought sleeping her way up the ladder was a shortcut. Margaret didn't hate her, she pitied her. Because Lena had no idea she was about to step into a war she couldn't win. One afternoon, Margaret asked Richard if she could host his next client dinner at their home. He seemed surprised but pleased. "You're finally coming around," he said, kissing her cheek. She smiled. "I just want to help, darling." The dinner was elegant, intimate. Margaret prepared every detail herself. She cooked, she decorated, she charmed his clients. Richard looked proud, like the king of the world with his perfect wife beside him. But what he didn't know was that every client at that table already knew the truth because Margaret had told them. Not directly, just whispers, hints of mismanagement, mentions of financial discrepancies, enough to plant the seed of doubt. She'd sent anonymous emails with carefully curated screenshots she'd taken from his private accounts, the ones where money quietly moved to places it shouldn't have. By the end of the dinner, Margaret didn't need to do anything else. The rumors would take care of the rest. 2 weeks later, Richard's phone calls became frantic. Deals were falling apart. Investors were reconsidering. His confidence began to crack. He snapped more often, pacing through the house, yelling at his phone, blaming the market, the clients, everyone but himself. Margaret stayed calm, supportive, even sympathetic. "You'll fix it," she said, resting a gentle hand on his arm. "You always do." He had no idea she was the one who'd set the fire under his feet, but Margaret wasn't done. She still needed him to feel it. She needed him to experience the helplessness she had lived with for years. Late one night, she sat at her computer and printed a stack of documents, emails between Richard and Lena, photos from their secret trips, transfers of company funds under her name. She tucked them neatly into a folder labeled, "For my attorney," and left it on his desk. The next morning, Richard stormed into the kitchen, face red with fury. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, waving the folder. Margaret looked up from her coffee. "It's proof," she said softly. "Proof that I know everything." He slammed the papers down. "You're bluffing. You can't use this against me." Her eyes were calm. "Oh, Richard, I already did." He blinked, confused. "I sent copies to your partners this morning, and the state licensing board. I thought they should know what kind of business you're running." He went pale. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe," she said, standing up. "But I'm finally free." He lunged toward her, but she didn't flinch. "Don't touch me," she said coldly. "Or I'll make sure everyone in this town knows who you really are." The silence that followed was thick, electric. Richard's chest heaved, his jaw clenched, but there was nothing he could say. That night, he slept in the guest room. Margaret didn't mind. The bed felt bigger without him in it. Days passed, and the fallout spread like wildfire. The company began to unravel. His partners distanced themselves. Lena stopped answering his calls. Margaret could almost hear his world collapsing piece by piece. But even as she watched his empire crumble, she wasn't satisfied. Revenge wasn't just about destruction, it was about transformation. She wanted him to understand the pain of being disposable, so when she found out he'd applied for a new business loan, she smiled. The bank manager happened to be an old friend of hers from church. Over coffee, she mentioned Richard's recent troubles. A few subtle words, a little empathy, and by the next morning, the loan was denied. Richard came home furious. "Do you have any idea what's happening to me?" he shouted. Margaret looked up from her book. "Yes," she said simply. "You're learning." He stared at her, speechless. That was the night he finally broke. He sat on the edge of the couch, head in his hands. "I don't know what happened to us," he said quietly. "We used to be happy." Margaret's voice was steady. "We were happy when you thought I didn't matter. Now that I do, you call it chaos." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. "You're not the same woman I married." "No," she said. "I'm the woman you created." He left the house that night, slamming the door behind him. Margaret didn't chase him. She poured herself a glass of wine, walked out onto the porch, and watched the moon rise. For the first time in decades, the silence around her didn't feel lonely, it felt powerful. Over the next few weeks, Margaret quietly finalized her moves. She met with her lawyer, filed for divorce, and ensured she'd get the house and half his remaining assets. The timing was perfect. His reputation was already destroyed, so he couldn't fight without exposing more dirt. By the time the papers were served, Richard was nothing but a shadow of the man he used to be. Margaret watched from the window as he opened the envelope in his car, his shoulders slumped. He looked up at the house one last time, then drove away. Inside, the clock ticked softly. Margaret smiled. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't ache. Revenge, she realized, wasn't about hating him. It was about reclaiming herself. She stood in the quiet glow of the kitchen, whispering, "Tomorrow, I start living again." The morning after Richard left, the house was unnervingly quiet. For 30 years, every sound, the closing of drawers, the distant hum of his morning calls had filled the walls. Now there was only stillness. For the first time, Margaret noticed how wide the kitchen windows were, how sunlight poured through like it was reclaiming space that had been dimmed by his shadow. She brewed herself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and just listened. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. There were still messes to clean up, of course. His clothes, the files, the traces of his existence scattered everywhere. But Margaret didn't rush. She moved through each room deliberately, choosing what to keep and what to let go. She packed his things into boxes, neatly labeled, stacked in the garage for him to collect whenever he was ready. She doubted he'd ever come back for them. When she reached their bedroom, she paused. His scent still lingered faintly on the pillow. She stood there for a long time, staring at the bed where so many lies had been told. Then she stripped the sheets, opened the window, and let the wind carry it all out. By the end of the week, the house no longer felt like theirs. It felt like hers. She started rediscovering parts of herself that had gone missing over the years. Margaret began gardening again, something she hadn't done since her 20s. She filled the backyard with roses and lavender, colors that reminded her of peace. On Saturdays, she took long drives to the coast, windows down, the wind tangling her hair. She joined a local art class, where she painted her first canvas, a stormy sea breaking into sunlight. The instructor told her it looked like a battle ending. She just smiled. But as her life began to blossom again, the echoes of Richard's downfall followed her like faint ripples. People in town whispered, some pitied him. Some admired her quiet strength. She didn't correct anyone's version of the story. She didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. One afternoon, while tending her garden, Margaret received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single letter from Richard. "I've lost everything. The business, the house, Lena. I know you probably hate me, but I need you to know, I see it now. You were right. I used you. I thought love was control. It wasn't. It was you. I'm sorry, Margaret, I truly am." She read the letter twice. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. She folded it neatly, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. The paper curled, turned black, and disappeared. Later that evening, she poured herself a glass of wine and stepped outside. The garden glowed beneath the moonlight. The wind carried the scent of lavender, and for a fleeting second, Margaret felt a strange peace, like the universe had exhaled with her. A few months later, she sold the company shares she'd acquired through the divorce. The money was enough to start over anywhere she wanted. But Margaret didn't want to run away. She wanted to rebuild. So she invested part of it into a women's resource center, somewhere women could go when they felt trapped, powerless, or silenced. She called it the Phoenix Project. Every time she walked through those doors and saw women smiling, learning, starting over, she felt something ignite inside her. Her story, once soaked in betrayal, had become a blueprint for others to rise from their own ashes. One evening, while leaving the center, she saw a familiar car parked nearby. A black sedan, Richard's. He looked thinner, older. Life had carved regret into his face. He stepped out slowly, eyes down, holding a small envelope. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see you, to say thank you for showing me what I really was." Margaret didn't move closer. She stood tall, calm. "You didn't need to come here for that," he nodded. "I know, but I wanted to see you one last time." He held out the envelope. "It's what's left of the company. I signed it over to you. You deserve it." She hesitated, then took it. "Not because I need it," she said, "but because I earned every piece of it." Richard gave a sad smile. "You always did. I just never saw it." He turned to leave. "Richard," she called softly. He paused. "I forgive you," she said. He looked back, eyes glassy. "You do?" "I do," she replied. "But I'll never forget." He nodded once, then walked away into the night. Margaret stood there until his taillights disappeared, then looked down at the envelope. She didn't feel triumph or bitterness, just closure. Weeks passed and Margaret flourished. Her laughter returned, real and unrestrained. Friends said she seemed younger, lighter. She didn't talk about Richard anymore. He was a story she'd finished writing. But one evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, a neighbor stopped by, a young woman, maybe in her early 30s. "You're Margaret, right?" "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I heard what you did for your husband. You made me realize I could walk away too. I left mine last month. I'm free." Margaret smiled softly. "Good for you, sweetheart. Freedom's the best revenge there is." After the woman left, Margaret leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea. The world was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was alive. She realized that revenge had never truly been about payback. It was about balance. About reclaiming what was stolen piece by piece until the scales finally tipped back in her favor. That night, she took her old wedding ring from the drawer where she'd kept it and carried it down to the shore. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath her bare feet. She stood at the edge of the water, holding the ring between her fingers. "For 30 years, you bound me," she whispered. "Now I release you." She tossed it into the waves. The ocean swallowed it whole, and with it, every ghost of the life she'd outgrown. As she turned to walk away, she smiled, because Margaret knew this was the real beginning. A woman reborn not by love or hate, but by her own strength. They said she'd crumble without him. They were wrong. Margaret didn't just survive. She rebuilt herself into something stronger than the storm that tried to destroy her. Because when a woman learns her worth, revenge isn't about making someone else fall. It's about rising higher than they ever imagined she could. If you believe every betrayal deserves its reckoning, hit follow, because next time you'll witness another woman's story of revenge where justice comes dressed in silence and fire.